The glass doors of the luxury car dealership slid open, and Margaret stepped inside. She had waited years for this moment. She had the money. She had the power. But the salesmen didn't see that. They saw an elderly woman with an old handbag. They smirked. They whispered. They refused to help her. And then they called security to throw her out. What happened next? Let's just say they made the biggest mistake of their lives. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. The glass doors of the luxury car dealership slid open with a soft whoosh, and Margaret Hayes stepped inside, her sharp eyes scanning the gleaming vehicles on display. She had waited for this moment for years, saving every dollar, making every sacrifice, pushing past every obstacle. And now she was finally here to buy the car she had dreamed of for decades. Dressed in a neatly pressed beige blazer and dark trousers, Margaret carried herself with quiet confidence. Though her worn leather handbag had seen better days, it held something far more valuable than money. It held the weight of her hard-earned success. The showroom was a palace of excess. Bright overhead lights reflected off the sleek, metallic surfaces of high-end sedans and sports cars lined up like trophies. The air carried the scent of polished leather and fresh espresso. Classical music played softly in the background, barely audible over the murmurs of wealthy customers. A waiter in a crisp white shirt moved between them, offering glasses of champagne as salespeople eagerly attended to their every request. Margaret took a deep breath. This wasn't just about buying a car. This was about fulfilling a promise she made to herself long ago. Growing up, her father, James Hayes, had been a mechanic. He spent his days fixing old engines, his hands always stained with oil, his eyes full of dreams he never got to chase. He used to tell Margaret stories about the luxury cars he read about in magazines, machines built with precision, speed, and elegance. But back then, owning one was a fantasy. Life never gave James the opportunity to drive one, let alone buy one. Now, his daughter was here to make that dream a reality. She stepped forward, her heart steady, her mind focused. But as she moved deeper into the showroom, something shifted. The friendly atmosphere that surrounded the other customers suddenly disappeared when she walked by. The salespeople's smiles faded the moment they saw her. Whispers rippled through the room. A few of them exchanged amused glances. Standing near the reception desk, Daniel Carter, the senior sales manager, leaned against the counter, smirking as he watched her. He was a man who thrived on power, judging people in an instant based on their appearance. His suit was tailored to perfection, his watch gleamed under the showroom lights, and his confidence was built on dismissing those he deemed unworthy. He nudged his colleague, Eric Mills, a younger salesman who had only been working at the dealership for a few months. "Looks like someone wandered into the wrong place," Daniel muttered, just loud enough for the other staff members to hear. Eric chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "Think she knows where she is?" Daniel smirked. "Doubt it." Margaret, unaware of their whispers, or perhaps choosing to ignore them, walked up to a sleek, silver luxury sedan, the very car she had envisioned owning for years. She ran her fingers lightly along its smooth surface, admiring the craftsmanship. It was perfect. She turned toward the reception desk, prepared to ask for assistance, when Sophia Lewis, the dealership's junior employee, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Sophia had seen the way Daniel and Eric treated certain customers, but she never had the courage to say anything. She bit her lip, watching as Margaret approached the desk. Before Margaret could say a word, Daniel stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice polite but laced with amusement. "Are you looking for something specific?" His eyes scanned her up and down, lingering on her handbag, the subtle judgment evident in his smirk. Margaret met his gaze, unfazed. "Yes," she said. "I'd like to learn more about this model. I've read about its performance and safety features." Daniel let out a small chuckle, glancing over his shoulder at Eric, who grinned in response. "That's quite the car," he said, his tone thick with mockery. "Are you sure you're looking at the right model? We have more affordable options over there." He gestured lazily toward the far end of the showroom, where older models were displayed. Margaret's warm smile didn't fade. I know exactly what I'm looking for, she replied, her tone calm but firm. Daniel sighed, shaking his head slightly. All right, he said, still smirking. But just so you know, this car is a high-end model. The price starts in the six-figure range. He emphasized the number as if it were meant to scare her away. Margaret didn't flinch. I'd still like to see it, she said simply. Daniel exchanged a quick glance with Eric, barely able to contain his amusement. Of course, he said, stepping aside, his voice exaggeratedly polite. Right this way. As Margaret followed him toward the car, she could feel the stares of the other staff members burning into her back. Their judgment hung in the air like a heavy cloud. They didn't take her seriously. They thought she was wasting their time. But what they didn't know, what they would soon realize, was that they had just made the biggest mistake of their careers. Margaret followed Daniel through the showroom, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. The silver luxury sedan gleamed under the bright overhead lights, its sleek curves a testament to engineering excellence. She admired it as they approached, running a hand along its polished surface. Daniel stood beside the car, arms crossed, his smirk unwavering. This model has a twin-turbo V8 engine, top-tier safety features, and an interior crafted from premium Italian leather, he said, his tone dripping with artificial politeness. It's a car built for those with refined taste. His emphasis on the last two words made his message clear. He didn't believe she belonged here. Margaret nodded, showing no reaction to his thinly veiled insult. And what's the horsepower? She asked. Daniel blinked, momentarily caught off guard. He hadn't expected her to ask a technical question. He quickly recovered, straightening his posture. Over 600 horsepower, he said, glancing sideways at Eric, who was watching from a few steps away. It's a beast on the road, but of course, with great power comes great responsibility. Cars like these require experience. Margaret gave a small smile, but there was something unreadable in her expression. Good to know, she said. And what about the braking system? Eric stifled a laugh. The brakes? He repeated, his voice laced with amusement. You really want to know about the brakes? Margaret didn't blink. Yes. Daniel's smirk faltered for a brief second before he forced another grin. High-performance carbon ceramic brakes, he replied, designed to stop on a dime. Margaret nodded again, as if considering the information. That's exactly what I was looking for, she said. Daniel raised an eyebrow, exchanging another glance with Eric. This conversation was lasting longer than he had anticipated. Most people who didn't belong here would have already gotten the message and left by now. But Margaret remained calm, unbothered by the obvious dismissal hanging in the air. Before he could respond, Leon Jacobs, the general manager, stepped out of his office, a steaming cup of espresso in hand. He was a middle-aged man with neatly combed silver hair and a tailored gray suit. His sharp eyes swept across the showroom, immediately narrowing when he spotted Margaret standing next to the luxury sedan. He strolled over, his expression unreadable. Daniel, he said, his voice smooth yet firm. Is there a problem here? Daniel chuckled. No problem at all, sir. Just giving this potential customer a quick overview of the car's features. Leon took one look at Margaret, then back at Daniel. His lips curled into a knowing smirk. Ah, I see, he murmured, taking a slow sip of his espresso before glancing at Margaret. Ma'am, these are high-end vehicles built for a very specific clientele. Are you sure this is the model you're interested in? Sophia, who had been listening from behind the reception desk, felt her stomach tighten. She had seen Leon do this before. Subtle humiliation disguised as professionalism. She clenched her fists, feeling an urge to step forward, but she knew better. Speaking up against Leon never ended well. Margaret, however, remained unfazed. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes locked on Leon's. I'm very sure, she said. Leon took another sip of his espresso, then let out a low chuckle. All right then, he said, setting his cup down on the counter. Let's cut to the chase. What's your budget? The words hung in the air, heavy with condescension. Daniel smirked. Eric folded his arms, and a few other salespeople, who had been pretending not to eavesdrop, waited in silent amusement. Margaret met Leon's gaze without hesitation. I don't have a budget, she said simply. For the first time, Leon's smirk wavered. No budget? He repeated. Margaret shook her head. No, she said. I came here to buy what I want, not what you think I can afford. A brief silence fell over the room. The staff looked at each other, struggling to hold back their laughter. Leon let out another low chuckle, shaking his head as he turned to Daniel. Call security, he said. I think our guest here might feel more comfortable elsewhere. Margaret's smile didn't fade. She calmly reached into her handbag, pulled out her phone, and pressed a single button. Leon raised an eyebrow. What are you doing? Margaret locked eyes with him, her voice steady. Changing the course of your day. Leon narrowed his eyes as Margaret held her phone to her ear, her expression calm, almost amused. The other sales staff exchanged glances, some barely suppressing their smirks. Daniel folded his arms, shaking his head. Eric let out a quiet chuckle. What, are you calling for backup? He muttered under his breath, nudging Daniel with his elbow. Margaret didn't react. The line rang once before a voice on the other end picked up. It's me, she said simply. I'm at the dealership. It's happening exactly as we expected. She listened for a moment before nodding. Yes, send them in. Then with an air of complete indifference, she slipped the phone back into her bag and turned to Leon. I suggest you hold off on that security call, she said. It won't age well. Leon's smirk returned, wider this time. Is that so? He said, crossing his arms. Listen, ma'am, I don't know what game you're playing, but this is a serious business. We don't have time for... Before he could finish, the glass doors of the showroom swung open with force. A man in a sharp black suit strode inside, his steps purposeful, his expression unreadable. Behind him followed two more men, both dressed in tailored suits, their presence instantly commanding the room's attention. The murmurs of wealthy customers died down, their eyes shifting toward the unexpected visitors. Daniel straightened slightly, his smirk faltering. Eric's arms slowly dropped to his sides. Even Leon, who was rarely rattled, felt something shift in the air. The man in the lead, Jonathan Reed, the regional director for the entire dealership chain, came to a stop in the middle of the showroom. His piercing gaze swept across the room before landing on Leon. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Leon swallowed hard but quickly composed himself. He took a step forward, forcing a polite smile. Jonathan, he said smoothly, this is a surprise. I wasn't expecting you. Jonathan didn't return the greeting. Instead, he turned his attention to Margaret. Miss Hayes, he said, his tone carrying a weight that no one in the room could ignore. Daniel's breath hitched. Miss Hayes? Margaret gave a small nod. Jonathan, she said, as if greeting an old friend. Jonathan's gaze flicked toward Leon. His expression hardened. Would you care to explain what's going on here? He asked, his voice dangerously calm. Leon hesitated. There was, just a small misunderstanding, he said quickly. Nothing serious. Margaret raised an eyebrow. A misunderstanding? She repeated. That's an interesting way to describe laughing at a customer and trying to throw them out. Jonathan's expression darkened. He turned toward the rest of the staff. Did she ask for anything unreasonable? He asked. Did she demand special treatment? The salespeople remained silent, avoiding his gaze. I see, Jonathan said, his voice laced with disappointment. Let me make something very clear. Miss Hayes is not just any customer. Eric, who had been shifting awkwardly, finally spoke. She's not? Jonathan's gaze snapped to him, and Eric immediately wished he had kept his mouth shut. No, Jonathan said. She's not. He exhaled sharply, then delivered the one sentence that made the entire showroom freeze. Miss Hayes is a major shareholder in this company. The room fell completely silent. Leon's smile disappeared. Daniel took a half step back. Eric's mouth dropped open, but no words came out. Even the customers who had been quietly observing were now whispering among themselves in disbelief. Sophia, standing near the reception desk, felt her breath catch in her throat. She had known something was off about the way Margaret carried herself. But this? Leon's voice, suddenly hoarse, broke the silence. Wait, you're saying she... Yes, Jonathan said coldly. She owns a significant portion of this company, and from what I've just witnessed, the employees of this particular dealership have treated her like garbage. The color drained from Leon's face. Margaret took a slow step forward. her posture still relaxed but her presence unshakable. "Now," she said, tilting her head slightly, "would you still like to call security?" Leon's hands trembled slightly, though he quickly shoved them into his pockets to hide it. His once confident smirk had vanished, replaced by a forced, nervous grin. He glanced at Daniel and Eric, both of whom looked as if they wanted to disappear into the floor. Margaret stood tall, her calm, unwavering gaze locked on Leon. "Well?" she asked again. "Are you still calling security? Or do you suddenly have a different perspective?" Leon let out a dry chuckle, but it was weak, hollow. "Miss Hayes, we didn't realize who you were," he stammered. "If we had known—" Margaret raised a hand, silencing him. "Stop," she said firmly. "That sentence? I've heard it too many times. If we had known. That's exactly the problem. You only treat people with respect when you think they have power. The moment someone doesn't fit your expectation of wealthy or important, you dismiss them like they're beneath you." Daniel, who had been frozen in place, tried to salvage the situation. He forced a laugh, stepping forward. "It was all just a big misunderstanding," he said quickly, his usual arrogance completely drained. "We treat all our customers with the highest level of—" Margaret turned her sharp gaze on him, and his voice died in his throat. "The highest level of what?" she asked. "Mockery? Assumptions? Disrespect?" She let out a short, humorless laugh. "I walked in here ready to buy a car. I asked simple, straightforward questions. And what did I get in return? Condescension, whispering, laughter. Then the moment I refused to be dismissed, your boss decided I should be escorted out." Daniel swallowed hard. I mean, save it," Jonathan interjected sharply. "This isn't something you can smooth over with excuses." Leon, realizing there was no escaping the fallout, shifted tactics. His tone turned pleading. "Miss Hayes, I assure you, this isn't how we normally operate. If you'd allow me, I'd love to personally assist you in choosing any car you like. We can offer—" Margaret shook her head. "I don't need special treatment," she said. "I needed basic respect. And you failed to give me even that." The weight of her words settled over the room. Some of the other employees, those who had stood silently, too afraid to challenge their managers, looked ashamed. Others, like Eric, looked panicked, realizing just how badly they had miscalculated. Sophia, who had been silently watching from the reception desk, felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and disbelief. She had wanted to speak up earlier, but she hadn't been brave enough. Now she was witnessing justice unfold right before her eyes. Margaret turned to Jonathan. "So what happens now?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Jonathan exhaled slowly, then looked at Leon, Daniel, and Eric. His expression was unreadable, but his disappointment was clear. "Effective immediately," he said. "Leon, you're fired." Leon's face turned ghostly pale. "Wait, what?" "Jonathan, please, you don't have to—" "This isn't a discussion," Jonathan said firmly. "You didn't just disrespect a customer, you disrespected an owner of this company. And frankly, even if she weren't a shareholder, your behavior today was unacceptable." Leon's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Jonathan's gaze shifted to Daniel and Eric. "As for you two," he continued, "you're both suspended, pending further review. But given what I've seen today, I wouldn't count on keeping your jobs." Daniel looked stunned, as if reality had just slapped him in the face. Eric swallowed hard, his earlier arrogance now replaced with quiet dread. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret took a deep breath, her face unreadable. Then she turned to Sophia. "What's your name?" she asked. Sophia's eyes widened slightly. I'm Sophia," she said nervously. Margaret gave a small nod. "You were the only one in this room who looked uncomfortable with what was happening," she said. "You didn't say anything, but you didn't laugh either." Sophia hesitated, unsure of what to say. "I wanted to," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I was scared." Margaret studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Fear is understandable," she said, "but choosing to do nothing is still a choice." Sophia lowered her gaze, ashamed. Then, to her complete shock, Margaret turned to Jonathan and said, "She deserves a promotion." The entire room stilled. Leon, who was still reeling from his own firing, let out a humorless laugh. "You're joking," he muttered. Margaret ignored him. "This dealership needs new leadership," she said. "Someone who understands what real customer service looks like." Jonathan considered her words, then looked at Sophia. "How long have you worked here?" he asked. 6 months, Sophia said quickly. Jonathan nodded slowly, thinking. "All right," he said after a pause. "Starting today, you'll be the interim manager while we restructure this location." Sophia's jaw dropped. "Me?" Margaret smiled faintly. "Yes," she said, "because I have a feeling you'll do better than the people who just got removed." Sophia was speechless, overwhelmed with emotions she couldn't even begin to process. Meanwhile, Leon, Daniel, and Eric stood completely frozen, watching as their world fell apart before their very eyes. And Margaret? She had barely even begun. Leon stood stiffly, his fists clenched at his sides. His carefully constructed world, built on arrogance and entitlement, was crumbling in real time. The same floor he had strutted across with confidence now felt like quicksand beneath his feet. Daniel and Eric weren't much better. The two salesmen, once smirking and full of mockery, now looked like ghosts of their former selves. Daniel's lips parted as if he wanted to argue, but even he knew there was nothing left to say. Sophia, on the other hand, could barely breathe. The weight of the moment sat heavy on her chest. In a matter of minutes, her world had flipped upside down. Just earlier that day, she was struggling to survive in a toxic work environment, scared to challenge the very people who had now been stripped of their power. Now she was being placed in charge of the very dealership that had once made her feel invisible. Jonathan turned toward the rest of the employees, scanning their faces. "Let this be a reminder," he said sharply. "This company does not tolerate discrimination, arrogance, or entitlement. If you work here, you treat every customer with respect." Period. A murmur of quiet, "Yes, sir," responses echoed through the room. No one dared to defy him. Margaret, who had remained silent for a few moments, finally took a step forward, directing her attention back to Leon. "You assumed I was beneath you the second I walked through those doors," she said evenly. "You laughed at me, mocked me, called security on me. And why? Because my clothes weren't designer? Because my handbag was old? Because you decided I wasn't worthy of your time?" Leon opened his mouth, but Margaret raised a hand, stopping him before he could utter a word. "I've spent my life building an empire," she continued, her voice steady, controlled. "Not just for myself, but for every person who has ever been told they don't belong. I don't need you to see my worth. I already know it. But today you learned exactly what it costs to judge someone too quickly." Leon's face twisted in frustration, but he couldn't argue. He had gambled on arrogance and lost everything. Margaret shifted her gaze to Daniel and Eric, who still hadn't recovered from the humiliation. "I assume you two thought this was funny earlier?" she asked. "Enjoyed your little game?" Daniel stiffened. It It wasn't personal," he blurted out, desperate to salvage what little dignity he had left. "We just misread the situation." Margaret let out a quiet chuckle. "Misread?" she repeated. "You didn't misread anything. You made a decision, a conscious choice, and choices have consequences." Eric nodded quickly, clinging to the hope that humility might save him. "We're really sorry, Miss Hayes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We didn't mean any harm." Margaret exhaled slowly, then shook her head. "Your apologies don't mean much now," she said, "because you didn't just disrespect me. You disrespected every customer who has ever walked through these doors and been judged unfairly. The only difference is, I had the power to do something about it." Daniel looked down at his shoes, his jaw tight. There was nothing left to say. At that moment, one of the other employees, a quiet, middle-aged man named Russell, who had worked at the dealership for years, finally stepped forward. His voice was hesitant, but firm. "Miss Hayes," he said, "for what it's worth, not everyone here agreed with how things were run." He shifted his gaze toward Leon. "Some of us just didn't have the power to change anything." Margaret studied him for a moment before nodding. "Then be part of the change now," she said simply. Russell swallowed, then gave a small nod. Jonathan turned to Leon and the other two disgraced salesmen. You have until the end of the day to clear out your things, he said flatly. Your employment here is over. Leon gritted his teeth, but he knew there was no saving this. With a sharp exhale, he turned and stormed toward his office, slamming the door behind him. Daniel and Eric stood awkwardly for a few moments before silently walking away, their heads low. Margaret watched them go, but she didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Their downfall was their own doing. A few of the remaining employees shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what came next. But Margaret had one final thing to do. She turned toward the luxury sedan, the very car that started this whole mess. The silver paint gleamed under the showroom lights, a perfect symbol of everything she had worked for. Then slowly, she walked toward it, letting her fingers glide along the polished hood. And then, in the most casual, effortless tone possible, she said, "I'll take this one." The entire room went silent. Jonathan smiled. "Excellent choice, Miss Hayes." And just like that, Margaret had the last word. Margaret's words hung in the air like a final verdict. The tension that had filled the room just moments ago had shifted, now replaced by a silent, undeniable truth. She had won. Sophia, still trying to process everything, felt her heart race as she watched Margaret run her hand along the hood of the luxury sedan, the same car Daniel and Leon had tried to keep away from her. The same car that, just minutes ago, they had insisted she couldn't afford. Now it belonged to her. Jonathan nodded approvingly. "Miss Hayes, we'll have the paperwork prepared right away. Would you like the car delivered to your residence?" Margaret glanced at the sleek silver machine before turning back to Jonathan. "No," she said, a slow, knowing smile forming on her lips. "I'll drive it out myself." The remaining staff stood frozen, unsure of what to say. Even some of the high-profile customers, men in tailored suits, women in designer heels, looked on, stunned by what had just unfolded. Margaret turned toward Sophia, the young woman still standing near the reception desk, stunned into silence. "You'll do well here," Margaret said simply. "Remember, real leadership isn't about power, it's about integrity." Sophia's breath hitched. She had never been told anything like that before. She had never been recognized for anything, let alone by someone as powerful as Margaret Hayes. I won't let you down," she managed to say. Margaret nodded once before stepping toward the front desk, placing her worn leather handbag on the counter, the same bag Daniel had laughed at. She calmly reached inside and pulled out a black leather checkbook. Daniel, who had been packing up his desk in the background, turned to look. His face twisted with disbelief as he watched Margaret flick open the checkbook with ease, signing her name in elegant, precise strokes. Margaret didn't need financing. She didn't need a loan. She didn't need permission. She was buying this car in full. Jonathan handed the keys over personally. "It's an honor to serve you, Miss Hayes," he said. Margaret accepted the keys without hesitation. "Next time," she said, glancing around the room, her voice steady, "treat everyone who walks through these doors with the same respect you're giving me now." There was no arrogance in her tone, no gloating, just an undeniable truth. She didn't need an apology. She had already gotten something far better. With that, Margaret turned and walked toward the exit, her heels clicking against the pristine showroom floor. Employees watched in stunned silence. Customers whispered in hushed voices. And then, with the confidence of someone who had earned her place in the world, Margaret Hayes stepped into her brand new car, started the engine, and drove it straight out of the showroom, leaving behind the people who had once doubted her and proving once again that she was unstoppable. As the silver luxury sedan glided smoothly onto the dealership's exit ramp, the hum of its powerful engine filled the air. Margaret gripped the leather steering wheel with steady hands, her posture relaxed, her expression unreadable. Through the rearview mirror, she caught a glimpse of the stunned faces still watching her from inside, the same people who had dismissed her. Leon stood frozen near his office doorway, his face a mixture of disbelief and frustration. He had lost everything in a matter of minutes: his career, his reputation, and the authority he had once flaunted over others, all gone. Daniel and Eric lingered by their desks, their confidence shattered. They had spent the entire day mocking the wrong woman, and now the consequences had arrived like a storm they never saw coming. Sophia, still standing near the reception desk, exhaled slowly, her mind racing. This wasn't just a victory for Margaret, it was a lesson for everyone. As Margaret pulled onto the main road, she took in the city skyline ahead of her. The sunlight reflected off the polished hood of her car, a car she had earned on her own terms. Her phone buzzed on the dashboard. A message from Jonathan. "Congratulations on your new purchase, Miss Hayes. It was an honor to witness what happened today. We'll be in touch regarding the dealership's restructuring." Margaret smiled faintly. She wasn't done yet. She had no interest in just punishing the people who had wronged her. That wasn't enough. She wanted real change. Another buzz. A second message, this time from one of her business associates. "I heard about what happened. If you're interested, I know of a few dealerships that could use better management. Call me when you're ready." Margaret's smile deepened. The arrogance she had faced today was nothing new. She had encountered people like Leon, Daniel, and Eric her entire life. But for the first time, she realized she had the power to do more than just prove them wrong. She had the power to change the entire system. She tapped the screen, saving the message for later. For now, she had other plans. The open road stretched ahead, endless and full of possibilities. And as Margaret pressed her foot on the accelerator, she knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The silver sedan moved effortlessly through the city streets, its engine humming with quiet strength. Margaret drove with a sense of calm, but her mind remained sharp, replaying the events of the day like a perfectly edited film. She had entered that dealership expecting a simple purchase, but walked out with something far more valuable. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. "Unknown number. Miss Hayes, I sincerely apologize for how you were treated today. Please allow me to make it up to you with a personal invitation to our exclusive luxury vehicle showcase next month. Consider it our way of rectifying today's unfortunate situation." Margaret smirked. The desperation was starting. These types of messages always came, once the damage was already done. Now that they knew who she was, they were scrambling to fix their mistake. But their sudden change in attitude wasn't real respect. It was fear. She ignored the message. At a red light, she glanced at the side mirror. The city moved around her. Pedestrians crossing streets, taxis honking impatiently, businessmen talking into their Bluetooth earpieces. It was a world she had once fought to enter. Now she was shaping it. Her thoughts were interrupted by another call, this time Clara, her trusted assistant. "Miss Hayes," Clara's voice came through crisp and efficient. "The board members have already been informed about today's incident. They're furious. Apparently, this isn't the first complaint about that dealership, but it's the first time someone with real influence called them out on it publicly." Margaret raised an eyebrow. Not the first complaint? That didn't surprise her. "Any consequences yet?" she asked. Clara didn't hesitate. "Leon was fired immediately, as you saw. Daniel and Eric are under review, but from what I'm hearing, they're as good as gone. The dealership itself is being placed under direct corporate oversight. They're rewriting company policy to prevent this from happening again." Margaret nodded. It was a start, but she wanted more than just policy changes on paper. "And the bigger picture?" she asked, keeping her voice measured. There was a brief pause before Clara replied. "Let's just say you've got their attention. More than a few investors are wondering if you'd be interested in taking a larger role in the automotive industry, owning more than just shares." Margaret let the words sink in. She had always invested in companies, but what if she ran one? The thought had never crossed her mind before, but now it intrigued her. The light turned green. She eased onto the gas pedal, the car moving forward smoothly, just like the opportunities unfolding before her. "Set up a meeting," Margaret finally said. "I want to see what they have in mind." Clara didn't miss a beat. "I'll arrange it." Margaret ended the call, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. Buying a car was never supposed to turn into a career-changing moment. But now she wasn't just thinking about one dealership. She was thinking about all of them. Margaret pulled into the underground parking lot of her corporate office, the smooth purr of the engine echoing off the concrete walls. As she parked, She allowed herself a moment to reflect. The day had started with a simple goal, to buy a car, but fate had turned it into something much bigger. She stepped out, the sound of her heels tapping against the pavement as she made her way to the elevator. The security guard at the entrance straightened up the moment he saw her, giving a respectful nod. "Good evening, Miss Hayes," he greeted. Margaret gave a small nod in return, pressing the button for the top floor. As the elevator doors slid shut, she exhaled slowly. The pieces were already shifting. Clara was waiting in her office when she arrived, a folder in hand, her expression as sharp as ever. "They moved fast," Clara said, handing Margaret the folder. "The official termination letters have been sent. Leon tried to contest it, but after today he had no ground to stand on. Daniel and Eric will be dismissed by the end of the week." Margaret flipped through the documents briefly before setting them down on her desk. That part was done. Clara cleared her throat. "But that's not all." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "The CEO of Crown Automotive personally called to apologize." Clara continued, her tone measured. "He's offering you an official seat on the executive board. He wants your input on restructuring not just that dealership, but the company's customer service policies nationwide." Margaret leaned back in her chair, considering the offer. She had spent years breaking into boardrooms that were never built for her. Now they were inviting her in, not just to listen, but to lead. "What's his angle?" Margaret asked. "Is this just damage control?" Clara smirked. "Most likely. Your name is trending. People are talking. They can't afford another PR disaster." Margaret tapped a finger against the armrest of her chair. She didn't care about saving their reputation. She cared about real change. "Tell them I'll consider it," she said finally. "But I don't just want a seat at the table. If I'm going to be involved, I want control." Clara's smirk widened. "I thought you'd say that." Margaret exhaled, glancing at the large window behind her desk. The city stretched out before her, a reminder of how far she had come. Today she had walked into a dealership and been dismissed. Tomorrow she might own the industry. And that was a future she was very interested in building. Margaret leaned forward, her fingers tapping lightly against the surface of her polished desk. The weight of the moment settled in, not as a burden, but as an opportunity. She had spent years making the right investments, placing her bets on businesses that aligned with her vision. But this was different. This was personal. Clara, still standing beside the desk, placed a tablet in front of her. "I pulled up the financial reports for Crown Automotive," she said. "They're stable, but there's a trend you'll find interesting." Margaret glanced at the numbers on the screen. Sales figures, dealership performance reports, customer satisfaction ratings. One detail stood out. "They're losing market share," she observed, "slowly but consistently." Clara nodded. "Exactly. And do you know why? Customer experience. Reports show that people are fed up with the kind of treatment you got today. Some just leave quietly. Others post about it. Either way, they're losing trust," Margaret smirked. "And now they suddenly care because I have the power to do something about it." Clara crossed her arms. "It's funny how quickly they change their tune when money's involved." Margaret studied the report again, her mind already 10 steps ahead. If she took the board seat, she wouldn't just be a voice in the room. She could reshape the entire culture of the company. She could make sure that no customer, regardless of how they looked, dressed, or spoke, was ever dismissed the way she had been. But an even bigger idea was forming. She looked up at Clara, her expression unreadable. "If Crown Automotive is struggling with customer trust," Margaret said, "how do their competitors look?" Clara's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly caught on. She tapped a few keys on the tablet, pulling up comparison data. Margaret scanned the numbers. Some companies were doing better than others, but none of them had a perfect reputation. A slow smile formed on her lips. "Why settle for fixing their problem," she murmured, "when I can build something better?" Clara froze for a moment, then let out a small chuckle. "You're not just thinking about taking a board seat, are you?" Margaret leaned back in her chair. "I'm thinking about owning something bigger." She had spent her life investing in companies. Now she was considering starting her own. Because today, a luxury dealership had tried to push her out. Tomorrow, she might be running the entire industry. Margaret sat still, Her fingers intertwined as she stared at the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office. The thought lingered in her mind, growing stronger with every passing second. She had spent years building her name, breaking through barriers and proving her worth in rooms where people like Leon and Daniel would have never let her in if they had the choice. But now they weren't the ones making the decisions. She was. Clara watched her closely, recognizing that expression. Margaret was planning something big. "You don't just want a seat at their table," Clara said slowly, as if piecing it together. "You want to build your own." Margaret finally leaned back, her smirk returning. "That's how real power works, Clara. Why fight for respect in a broken system when you can build something better?" Clara let out a low whistle. "You're not just talking about influencing Crown Automotive, are you?" Margaret shook her head. "Number. If I step into their boardroom, I'll be playing by their rules. The only way to truly change the way this industry operates is to own it. The dealerships, the supply chain, the experience." She paused, then added, "Everything." Clara exhaled, pacing slightly as she processed the gravity of what Margaret was saying. "Do you know what that would take?" she asked. "The kind of capital, the connections? We're not talking about a small business here. This is an industry dominated by old money, by people who have controlled it for generations." Margaret remained unshaken. "So?" she said. "Everything I have, I built from nothing. The difference between me and them? I know what it's like to be on both sides. They don't." Clara couldn't argue with that. Margaret had worked in boardrooms full of billionaires, but she had also been the person on the outside, dismissed and underestimated. She understood the flaws in the system not just from a financial perspective, but from experience. She tapped her fingers against the desk. "I need numbers," Margaret said. "What does it take to open a competitive dealership chain? Not just one showroom, multiple. One in every major city, targeting every demographic that companies like Crown have ignored." Clara's eyes widened. "You're serious?" Margaret gave her a pointed look. "I'll make some call," Clara said quickly. "It'll take time, but—" "We don't have time," Margaret interrupted. "This industry is already shifting. The old way of doing business is fading, whether they like it or not. The first person to create an inclusive, customer-first dealership model will control the market for the next 50 years. Clara ran a hand through her hair, shaking her head in disbelief. "You're talking about rewriting the entire luxury automotive experience." Margaret smiled. "Yes." There was a knock at the office door. Both women turned as David Monroe, one of Margaret's most trusted business advisors, stepped inside. He was tall, sharp-dressed, and had worked alongside Margaret for years, handling high-level acquisitions. If anyone could assess the scale of what she was planning, it was him. "I hear you had an interesting day," David said, closing the door behind him. Margaret gave a short chuckle. "You could say that." David took a seat across from her. "I just got off the phone with a few board members from Crown Automotive," he said. "They're nervous. Your name is all over the industry right now, and they don't like it. They're scrambling to offer you whatever they can to keep you from becoming a problem for them." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess. A bigger stake in the company? A top advisory role?" David nodded. "Exactly. They're willing to put you at the table." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "But they're not offering me control." David smirked. "No, they're not, because they don't realize yet that you don't need their table." Clara let out a small laugh. "She's planning something bigger," she told him. "Not just a stake in Crown, a rival company, one that actually puts customers first." David blinked, then leaned back in his chair. "You're serious?" Margaret simply smiled. David let out a breath, considering. Then finally he said, "You know, there's already a loophole in the industry that could work in your favor." Margaret sat forward, interested. "Go on." David crossed his arms. "Luxury car dealerships are franchises, right? The big manufacturers, Mercedes, BMW, Rolls-Royce. They don't actually own most of the dealerships. Private investors do. You don't need to build a new car company to dominate the industry. You just need to control the dealerships." Clara's eyes widened. "Wait, You're saying she could buy out existing showrooms? David nodded. If you acquire the right dealerships, ones that are already struggling under outdated leadership, you could restructure them under your own brand. You'd have the infrastructure, the locations, and the manufacturer relationships already in place. Margaret tapped her fingers against the desk, already thinking through the possibilities. She could take everything they had ignored, the customers they dismissed, the buyers they failed to serve, the communities they didn't care about, and turn it into an empire, a dealership chain unlike any other, one built on experience, respect, and real service. David studied her. I know that look, he said. You've already decided, haven't you? Margaret's smirk returned. Clara, she said, start looking into underperforming dealerships, ones with bad customer satisfaction ratings, poor management, and outdated sales strategies. Clara nodded, already reaching for her laptop. David, Margaret continued, find out which investors are willing to sell. Money talks, and I want to know who's ready to listen. David grinned. This is going to make a lot of people nervous. Margaret simply shrugged. They should be. For years, she had been pushed to the side, ignored, underestimated. Not anymore. Now she wasn't just buying a car. She was about to own the entire industry. The office hummed with quiet intensity. Margaret sat at her desk, her mind already moving at a relentless pace, fitting together the puzzle pieces of her next move. This wasn't just about proving a point anymore. It was about seizing control of an industry that had overlooked the very people who kept it alive. Clara was already typing furiously on her laptop, cross-referencing dealership performance reports, financial records, and ownership structures. David leaned back in his chair, scrolling through his phone, making mental notes of which investors might be interested in selling their franchises. Margaret exhaled slowly, watching them work. These were the moments she thrived in, when an idea was no longer just a thought, but the foundation of something unstoppable. David looked up. You know, if we're doing this, we need to start fast. The moment Crown Automotive realizes what's happening, they'll start throwing obstacles in your way. They're not just going to let you walk in and take market share without a fight. Margaret smirked. I'm counting on it. David chuckled. Of course you are. Clara suddenly sat up straighter. Got something, she said, her voice tinged with excitement. There's a group of dealerships struggling on the West Coast. 5 locations, all underperforming. The owner, Michael Stanton, has been looking to offload them for months, but no one has been willing to take on the risk. Margaret arched an eyebrow. Why are they underperforming? Clara turned the laptop screen toward her. Classic case of mismanagement, outdated sales tactics, a lack of customer engagement, and, surprise, surprise, terrible service. Their reviews are a disaster. Customers complain about being ignored, disrespected, and judged the moment they walk in the door. David let out a low whistle. Sounds like a perfect place to start. Margaret nodded slowly. Get me a meeting with Stanton. Clara hesitated. There's just one issue. Margaret raised an eyebrow. What is it? Clara sighed. He's not going to sell to just anyone. He's been in the business for decades, and from what I'm reading, he's stubborn. The only way he'll sell is if he's convinced the new owner won't just flip the dealerships for a quick profit. Margaret smirked. Then I guess I'll have to convince him. David leaned forward. We should be strategic about this. If Stanton sells to you, people will notice. We need to make sure that by the time Crown Automotive realizes what's happening, it's already too late. Margaret thought for a moment, then nodded. Agreed. We stay quiet, for now. Let's move on Stanton first, secure the deal, then expand from there. Clara was already dialing. I'll get his office on the line. Margaret drummed her fingers against the desk. This was happening. For years, she had watched people like Leon and Daniel control the narrative, deciding who was worth their time and who wasn't. She had seen too many businesses fall apart because they refused to evolve. That was their mistake, and she was about to capitalize on it. The meeting. 2 days later, Margaret walked into a quiet, upscale restaurant where Michael Stanton had agreed to meet. The place was classic. Dark wood, soft lighting, the kind of spot where powerful men made million-dollar deals over expensive whiskey. Michael was already seated at a corner booth, his sharp blue eyes watching her as she approached. He was in his late 60s, a man who had built his fortune decades ago and wasn't used to being challenged. Margaret extended her hand. "Mr. Stanton." He shook it, firm but assessing. "Miss Hayes, I've heard a lot about you." Margaret smiled as she took a seat. "I hope some of it was good." Michael chuckled, signaling the waiter for a drink. "Depends on who you ask. Some people think you're a visionary, others think you're a threat." Margaret's smile didn't waver. "They're not wrong." Michael leaned back, studying her. "Let's cut to it. You want my dealerships? Why?" Margaret met his gaze without hesitation. "Because I see their potential," she said, "and I see what's holding them back." Michael smirked. "And what's that?" Margaret folded her hands on the table. "A lack of vision. The industry has changed, but the people running it haven't. Customers today don't just want luxury, they want experience. They want to feel respected, valued, and understood. Your dealerships aren't failing because of the cars you sell. They're failing because people walk in and feel like they don't belong." Michael raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "And you think you can fix that?" Margaret nodded. "I don't think. I know." The older man took a slow sip of his drink, considering her words. "You know, I built those dealerships from the ground up," he said. "They were successful once. But things change." Margaret tilted her head. "That's the difference between you and Crown Automotive. You recognize when change is necessary. They don't." Michael let out a short laugh. "You really don't like them, do you?" Margaret's expression darkened just slightly. "I don't like what they represent. Entitlement, arrogance, disrespect. They treat their customers like they should be grateful to be allowed in their showrooms. That's not how business works anymore." Michael swirled the liquid in his glass. "So what's your plan? If I sell to you, what happens next?" Margaret leaned forward slightly. "I rebrand, I rebuild. I change the culture from the inside out. I make customer service the priority, not an afterthought. I create an environment where people actually want to buy their cars. And when people see what we're doing, they'll stop going to dealerships like Crown altogether." Michael studied her for a long moment, then set his glass down with a quiet clink. "You remind me of myself," he said. "Back when I started out, before the industry made me tired." He exhaled. "I'll be honest, I wasn't sure if I wanted to sell. But after this conversation," he leaned forward, his gaze sharp, "I think you're exactly what this business needs." Margaret smiled. "Does that mean we have a deal?" Michael nodded. "We have a deal." They shook hands, and just like that, Margaret had taken her first step toward building an empire. As she walked out of the restaurant, her phone buzzed with a new message. Jonathan Reed. "I heard you met with Michael Stanton. We should talk." Margaret smirked, slipping her phone back into her bag. They were finally paying attention, but by the time they realized what she was really doing, it would already be too late. Margaret stepped out of the restaurant, the deal with Michael Stanton sealed in stone, and the weight of a new reality settled over her. She wasn't just an investor anymore. She was now an owner. The cool evening air brushed against her face as she walked toward her car, her thoughts already racing ahead. 5 dealerships. That was the beginning. But it wouldn't stop there. Her phone buzzed again. Jonathan Reed, the regional director of Crown Automotive, the same man who had walked into that dealership days ago, realizing too late who she really was. "I heard you met with Michael Stanton. We should talk." Margaret smirked at the message but didn't respond immediately. "Let him wait." She slid into the driver's seat of her luxury sedan, the very car that had started this entire ordeal, and let her hands rest on the steering wheel for a moment. Crown Automotive wasn't stupid. They had figured out what she was doing. They knew this wasn't just about a bad customer service experience anymore. This was a takeover. The warning call. Her phone rang. This time, Clara. "Tell me you have good news," Clara said without greeting. Margaret smiled. "I don't just have good news," she replied. "I have a signed contract." There was silence on the other end for a moment before Clara let out a low whistle. "You really did it," she muttered. "You just took over 5 dealerships in a market that Crown has been trying to dominate for years." Margaret's smile widened. "And I'm just getting started." Clara's voice turned serious. "Then you should know. They're trying to stop you." Margaret's expression didn't change, but her fingers tightened slightly around the wheel. What are they doing? Jonathan Reed isn't just reaching out to you, Clara said. Crown's corporate office is already making moves. They're trying to block your acquisition by offering Stanton more money to back out. Margaret's jaw tightened. That won't work. The deal is signed. Legally, no, Clara agreed. But if they can pressure Stanton into breaking the deal, it could still create problems. They might try to bury you in legal battles, slow down your expansion, and bleed you out before you can even establish yourself. Margaret exhaled. Of course, Crown Automotive had run the industry unchecked for decades. They weren't going to roll over and let her walk in without a fight. She checked the time. 8:45 p.m. Where's Stanton now? She asked. Clara hesitated. Still at the restaurant, I think. Margaret's grip on the steering wheel tightened. She needed to make sure Stanton wouldn't break. Face to face with the competition. Less than 15 minutes later, Margaret pulled back into the restaurant parking lot. The neon glow of the sign flickered against the pavement as she stepped out of her car and walked back inside. Michael Stanton was still at his booth, sipping what looked like his second drink, but this time he wasn't alone. Sitting across from him was a man Margaret recognized immediately, David Harrington, one of Crown Automotive's most aggressive executives, a man known for getting what he wanted no matter the cost. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line as she approached the table. Michael looked up, surprised. Margaret? David glanced over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing slightly before he smirked. Miss Hayes, he greeted smoothly. What a coincidence. Margaret didn't sit. She crossed her arms and looked directly at Michael. Didn't expect to see you in another meeting so soon, she said, voice calm but firm. Michael sighed, setting his glass down. David here just dropped in, he admitted. Made me an offer. Margaret didn't break eye contact. Is that right? David chuckled, leaning back in his chair. Nothing personal, he said. Just business. You know how it is. We heard you were making moves, and Crown Automotive wanted to make sure Mr. Stanton explored all of his options. Margaret tilted her head slightly. And what exactly are you offering him? David's smirk widened. Double what you paid. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He was a businessman, and businessmen liked money. Margaret could see it in his eyes. He was tempted, but she wasn't about to let Crown steal this deal from under her. She pulled out the contract from her bag and placed it on the table between them. You already signed this, she reminded him. And I trust you're a man of your word, Michael. Michael hesitated. David chuckled. Come on, Margaret. Do you really think loyalty is worth more than a few extra million? Margaret turned her gaze on him, calm, unshaken. I think integrity is worth more than desperation, she said. And that's exactly what this looks like. David's smirk faltered, just slightly. Margaret continued, her voice unwavering. If Crown Automotive wasn't threatened by me, you wouldn't be here right now, she said. You wouldn't be throwing money at a problem you didn't see coming. You wouldn't be trying to bribe your way out of a mistake you didn't even realize you made. David's jaw clenched. Margaret turned back to Michael. You can take their money, she said. You'll make a short-term profit. But in the long run, you'll still be dealing with the same people who ran your business into the ground in the first place. Michael exhaled, rubbing his temple. Margaret leaned in slightly. One final push. Or, she said, voice smooth, steady, you can be part of something better. Something that changes the way this industry works. Something that, years from now, people will look back on and realize you were one of the first to see the future. Silence. Michael studied her, then glanced at David, who looked like he was ready to snap. Then finally, Michael reached for his drink, took a slow sip, and placed the glass down. I already signed with Margaret, he said, and I don't go back on my word. David's expression darkened. You're making a mistake. Michael shrugged. Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. Margaret smiled. He had made the right choice. David exhaled sharply, standing up. He gave Margaret a long, hard look before muttering, This isn't over. Margaret smirked. No, David, she said. It's just beginning. David walked out, but Margaret knew this was only the first battle. Crown Automotive had fired their first shot. Now it was her turn. The door swung shut behind David Harrington, but his presence still lingered in the air. Margaret could practically hear the gears turning in his head, strategizing, scheming. Crown Automotive wasn't going to let this go. Michael let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple before looking at her with a tired smile. "You sure know how to handle yourself," he admitted. Margaret took her seat across from him, this time more relaxed. "People like David have been trying to intimidate me my entire life," she said simply. "He's not the first, and he won't be the last." Michael chuckled. "Well, he didn't expect you to stand your ground. That much was clear." He shook his head. "But you do know what this means, right?" Margaret nodded. "Crown won't stop at this. They'll keep coming." Michael took another sip of his drink. "Exactly. You rattled them today, and they're going to throw everything at you to stop this deal from going through smoothly. If you don't have the right people behind you, you're walking into a war with one hand tied behind your back." Margaret leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table. "Who says I'm walking in unprepared?" Michael studied her, his expression unreadable. "You're confident," Margaret smiled. "I have a reason to be." Michael let out a small laugh. "All right then, since we're business partners now, what's your next move?" Margaret tapped her fingers against the table, thinking. "Crown made one thing clear tonight," she said. "They assumed I was a small problem, something they could buy off, silence, or intimidate. They thought I was just another investor looking for a quick profit." She exhaled, a glint in her eyes. "They were wrong." Michael smirked. "And what exactly are you?" Margaret smiled back. "I'm their biggest threat. The next strike." By the time Margaret returned to her office later that night, she was already 5 steps ahead. Clara and David were waiting for her, both looking expectant. "Well?" Clara asked, closing the folder she had been reviewing. "Did he take their offer?" Margaret tossed her handbag onto the desk and sank into her chair. "No," she said. "He's sticking with me." David let out a low whistle. "That's a big win. But you know they're not stopping here, right?" Margaret nodded. "Which is why we need to make our next move before they do." Clara pulled out her tablet. "We've already been tracking their recent investments. If they're trying to block you from acquiring dealerships, the best way to counter that is to start securing more locations before they realize what's happening." Margaret glanced at David. "How many dealership owners are in the same position as Stanton?" David sat forward, flipping through his notes. "More than you think. A lot of them are drowning in mismanagement. But Crown hasn't bothered to step in because they assume the locations aren't worth it. They focus their energy on their flagship stores, the big markets. But that means smaller dealerships have been struggling under outdated leadership." He looked up. "Those are the ones you should go after next." Margaret's mind was racing. This wasn't just about taking what Crown valued. It was about taking what they overlooked. She pulled up a map of the country on her laptop. "I don't want just one region," she said. "If I only operate on the West Coast, they'll pin me down before I expand." She tapped different areas of the map. "We need to secure locations in multiple cities at the same time." Clara's eyes widened. "That's ambitious." Margaret didn't flinch. "It's necessary," David exhaled. "All right, if we're doing this, we'll need to start making calls tomorrow morning. We have to move fast." Clara glanced at her phone. "Then you should also know, Jonathan Reed has been calling. He left another message. He's asking for a meeting." Margaret smirked. "I bet he is." David raised an eyebrow. "Are you going to take it?" Margaret leaned back in her chair, thinking. Jonathan wasn't like David Harrington. He wasn't a snake in a suit trying to sabotage her at every turn. But he was still part of the old system. "I'll meet with him," she said finally, "but not on his terms. If he wants to talk, he can come to me." Clara grinned. "You want to make him sweat a little?" Margaret chuckled. "Let him sit with his thoughts. Let him wonder what I'm planning." She paused. "Because by the time they figure it out, it'll already be too late." The game changes. The next morning, Margaret sat in her office, the city skyline stretching beyond her windows. Her phone buzzed. "Clara." "They're scrambling," Clara said immediately. "We've been getting calls from people inside Crown's corporate office. They know you're acquiring more locations, but they don't know which ones. They're panicking." Margaret smiled. "Good. She had them exactly where she wanted them." And Jonathan? She asked. Clara hesitated. He's here. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Already? Clara's voice held a note of amusement. He's downstairs in the lobby. Apparently, he didn't want to wait for an invitation. Margaret smirked. He was nervous. David walked in, overhearing the conversation. So what's the play? He asked. Margaret stood, smoothing out her blazer. Simple, she said. We make it clear that the old way of doing things is over. Clara glanced toward the door. You want me to send him up? Margaret exhaled, thinking for a brief second before nodding. Let him in. David chuckled. Let's see what he has to say now that the power dynamic has shifted. Margaret smiled. Exactly. Moments later, Jonathan Reed stepped into her office. His usual confident stride had a slight hesitation to it. Margaret didn't stand. She remained seated, watching him with calm amusement as he approached. Jonathan exhaled sharply. Miss Hayes, he greeted, trying to maintain his composure. Margaret tilted her head slightly. Jonathan. He hesitated, then got straight to the point. We need to talk. Margaret leaned back in her chair, crossing one leg over the other. Oh? She asked, her voice smooth. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Crown Automotive has a proposal. Margaret's smile didn't fade. Let's hear it. Jonathan placed a file on her desk. They're willing to offer you a controlling stake in the company. Clara and David exchanged looks of pure shock. Margaret tapped her fingers against the desk. Interesting. They want you on the inside, she mused. After everything? Jonathan nodded. They don't have a choice. You're becoming too powerful. Margaret smiled slowly. Exactly as planned. But what Crown didn't realize was that she had never been interested in just joining them. She had been planning to replace them, and now she had the leverage to do exactly that. Margaret let the words hang in the air. A controlling stake. The ultimate power move from a company that had spent decades pushing out competition, dictating the market, and deciding who was worthy of luxury and who wasn't. But now they were begging her to join them. She took her time flipping through the file Jonathan had placed on her desk. It was all there. A formal offer from Crown Automotive, granting her enough shares to have a deciding vote on all major decisions. On the surface, it looked like a golden opportunity, but Margaret knew exactly what it was. A trap. Jonathan sat across from her, watching her carefully. His usual confidence was still there, but there was something different in his posture, a tension he couldn't quite hide. He knew this offer wasn't a gift. It was a last resort. Margaret exhaled softly, closing the file. This is cute, she said, tapping the folder. Really? A nice gesture. Jonathan's jaw tightened. It's not a gesture, Margaret. It's an opportunity. You want change? This is your chance to do it from the inside. Margaret leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the desk. If I join Crown Automotive, I'll be playing by your rules. I'll be sitting at a table where your board still calls the shots. Every decision I make will have to be run through your system. She smiled. And forgive me, Jonathan, but I have no interest in being controlled. Jonathan's fingers tightened around the armrest of his chair. You think you can beat us? He asked, his voice measured. Take over the entire industry? Compete against decades of dominance? Margaret met his gaze, calm and unwavering. I don't think I can, she said simply. I know I can. Jonathan exhaled sharply. Damn it, Margaret, he muttered. This is bigger than just you. Do you realize how much they're willing to give you to make this problem go away? Margaret chuckled, tilting her head. That's exactly the issue, Jonathan, she said. I'm not a problem to be dealt with. And that's where Crown made its mistake. You think money, power, and a seat at your table is all I want. But what I want, she leaned back, her smirk widening, is for there to be no more tables like yours at all. Jonathan's face hardened. You're making a mistake. Margaret shook her head. No, Jonathan, she said smoothly. Crown made the mistake the day they underestimated me. Jonathan let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple as if trying to keep his frustration in check. If you walk away from this, they'll come at you harder than ever, he warned. You won't just be competing anymore. They'll destroy you. Margaret's expression didn't waver. They can try. Jonathan studied her for a long moment, then let out a quiet chuckle. You really don't scare easy, do you? Margaret smiled. No, she said simply. Jonathan sighed, standing up. He adjusted his jacket, looking down at the file still sitting on her desk. So that's it? He asked. You're rejecting the offer? Margaret tapped the folder once before sliding it back across the desk. No hard feelings, she said. It was a nice try. Jonathan chuckled dryly, shaking his head. I'll tell them you said no. Margaret stood, walking around the desk to face him directly. Tell them they should have treated me with respect when they had the chance. Jonathan gave her one last look, part frustration, part reluctant admiration, before heading toward the door. Just as he reached it, Margaret called out, Oh, and Jonathan? He paused, glancing over his shoulder. Margaret smiled. Next time we meet, it won't be you making me an offer. It'll be me making you one. Jonathan smirked slightly. I'll look forward to it. Then without another word, he left. The moment the door shut behind him, Clara and David both burst out laughing. That was incredible, Clara said, shaking her head. They're terrified of you, and it's only the beginning. David grinned. I almost feel bad for them, he said. Almost? Margaret smiled, but she wasn't celebrating yet. They had tried to buy her out before she could become too powerful. That meant they knew she was a real threat now, which also meant they were going to retaliate. She turned to Clara. How many dealerships have agreed to sell so far? Clara swiped through her tablet. With Stanton's locations confirmed, we have 10. David let out a low whistle. That's enough to launch a full-scale competitor, he said. You're not just playing in their market anymore, Margaret. You're about to take it over. Margaret nodded slowly. That was the plan. For decades, the luxury automotive world had belonged to the same people, the same names, the same corporations, the same power structures. That era was coming to an end. Crown Automotive had shown their hand. They had offered her a seat at their table, not because they respected her, but because they were afraid of her. And they were right to be. Margaret turned to the window, staring at the city skyline, her mind already focused on what came next. She wasn't just building a brand. She was building an empire. And by the time Crown Automotive realized what had hit them, she would own everything they thought they controlled. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button and let us know your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in this situation? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this. Share this video with someone who needs to see it.